I will never forget that spring day in Seville when my life took an unexpected turn. The sun shone brightly on the cobblestone streets of our beautiful city, but inside our house in the Santa Cruz neighborhood, a shadow loomed over us. My husband Diego had just hung up the phone, his face a mixture of concern and resignation. "Honey," she told me with a shaky voice, "my parents are in trouble. They've lost almost everything and, well, they need a place to stay for a while." I felt a knot in my stomach. Julia and Enrique, my in-laws, had always been proud and self-sufficient people. Seeing them in this situation broke my heart, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel a pang of anxiety at the thought of having them living with us. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "We have plenty of room. You can stay in the guest room." The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. We cleaned the room, bought new sheets, and even rearranged part of the house to give them more space. I wanted them to feel welcome, despite my internal reservations. On the day of his arrival, the doorbell rang promptly at 10 in the morning. I opened the door to find Julia, a small woman but with an imposing presence, and Enrique, tall and with a serious look. They both looked like they had aged 10 years since I last saw them. "Welcome," I said, hugging them. "Please come in. You must be exhausted from the trip." Julia hugged me back tightly. "Thank you, dear. You don't know how much we appreciate this." Enrique just nodded, carrying his suitcases in silence. I guided them to their room, showing them where we had saved space for their things in the closet and drawers. "I hope you're comfortable here," I said. "We have tried to ensure that they have everything they need." Julia looked around with a critical eye. "It's cozy," he commented, and I could detect a tone of disapproval in his voice. "Although the color of the walls is a little somber, don't you think? A lighter tone would brighten the space a lot." I felt like I had been slapped, but I maintained my composure. "Well, we can consider repainting it if you prefer," I responded diplomatically. The first few days were tense but manageable. Julia and Enrique seemed genuinely grateful, helping with household chores and taking care of our children when Diego and I worked. However, little by little, they began to show their true nature. One afternoon, I returned from work to find the kitchen completely reorganized. Plates, glasses, and utensils were in different places, and the refrigerator had been cleaned and rearranged. "Julia," I asked, trying to stay calm, "have you moved everything around?" She looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, yes, dear. It's just that your previous system was a bit chaotic. Everything makes more sense now, don't you think?" I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my mind. "I appreciate your initiative, but I wish you'd consulted with me first. This is my kitchen and I had things organized in a way that worked for me." Julia looked offended. "Well, I thought you'd be grateful for the help. After all, with your job and the kids, you clearly don't have much time to keep the house in order." That night, while we were having dinner, I noticed that Enrique was frowning when he tasted the paella he had prepared. "It's interesting," he commented. "Although I think it lacks a touch of saffron. Julia always makes exquisite paella, right, darling?" Julia nodded smugly. "Maybe I could teach you some tricks in the kitchen, dear. It's important for Diego to eat well." I felt anger bubbling up inside me, but I just forced a smile and changed the subject. However, these incidents accumulated day after day. One morning, I walked into the living room to find that all the furniture had been moved. "What's going on here?" I asked, unable to hide my frustration. Enrique, who was pushing the couch to a new position, looked at me in surprise. "Oh, good morning. Julia and I think that this arrangement makes better use of natural light. Plus, now there is more space to circulate." But I had the furniture like that for a reason," I protested. "The TV is now too far from the sofa, and the coffee table blocks the way to the balcony." Julia appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands with a cloth. "My dear, sometimes it takes a fresh eye to see things differently. Trust us, this layout is much better." I felt helpless in my own home. Each day brought a new surprise, a new veiled criticism, or an unsolicited change. My in-laws, who initially seemed grateful for our help, were now acting like they owned the place. One afternoon, while cleaning the bathroom, I heard Julia talking on the phone in the hallway. Yes, sister, we are fine here. Although, frankly, I am surprised how they run the house. If it weren't for us, this would be a disaster. But don't worry, little by little we are putting things in order. I felt tears of frustration threatening to spill. How had we gotten to this point? How had my in-laws gone from grateful guests to relentless critics of my home and lifestyle? That night, when Diego came home from work, I tried to talk to him about the situation. Honey, I said quietly as we got ready for bed, I think we need to set some boundaries with your parents. They're taking too much control over the house. Diego looked at me with a tired expression. Come on, love, they're just trying to help. You know they've been through a lot. We should be understanding. I know, I responded, feeling a mix of frustration and guilt. But this is our house, Diego. I feel like I no longer have a say in the decisions that are made here. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'll talk to them, okay? I'll ask them to consult with us before making big changes. But please be patient. They just need time to adjust. I nodded, unconvinced. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could endure this situation. What had started as an act of kindness was quickly turning into a domestic nightmare, and I increasingly felt like a stranger in my own home. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Julia and Enrique's presence in our house went from being a temporary situation to what seemed like a permanent arrangement. And with each passing day, their interference in our lives became more pronounced and difficult to ignore. One Saturday morning, while I was preparing breakfast for my children, Sophia, 8, and Mateo, 5, Julia entered the kitchen with that air of superiority that I had come to fear. "Good morning, dear," he said, looking over my shoulder as he spread jam on the toast. "Don't you think children should eat something more nutritious? Some porridge would be much better than those toasts full of sugar." I took a deep breath before answering. "Julia, I appreciate your concern, but the children are fine. They have a balanced diet and some toast with jam from time to time won't hurt them." She clicked her tongue disapprovingly. In my time, children ate what was given to them and that was it. Such indulgence is not good for them. Before he could respond, Sophia ran into the kitchen. "Mom, can I go to the park with Lucia after breakfast?" "Sure, honey," I replied with a smile. "But remember that you have to finish your homework before dinner." Julia intervened immediately. "Homework on Saturday? Girl, you should be studying right now. The park can wait. When your father was little, he studied every day, even on weekends." I watched Sophia's smile fade, and I felt anger rising inside me. "Julia, please. Sophia is an excellent student and deserves to enjoy her weekend. We already talked about not interfering with the children's education." "I'm just trying to help," Julia replied, offended. "Someone has to think about their future." Confrontations like this became more and more frequent. Julia never missed an opportunity to question my parenting decisions, from the clothes I chose for the children to bedtime. Every comment, every look of disapproval, was like a small stab at my confidence as a mother. Enrique, for his part, had decided that the house needed improvements. One day, I came home from work to find that he had replaced all the light bulbs with energy-efficient ones without consulting us. "Enrique," I said, trying to stay calm, "I appreciate that you want to help, but these decisions should be made by Diego and me." He looked at me condescendingly. "Come on, daughter. I'm just trying to save you money. With what you spend on electricity, you'd think you're lighting up the entire neighborhood." But the last straw came one afternoon when I found Enrique talking on the phone with a contractor. "Yes, I want you to come look at the roof next week. I think it needs a complete repair," I heard him say. I waited for him to end the call before confronting him. "Enrique, what are you doing? You can't make decisions about major repairs without consulting us." He seemed surprised by my reaction. "I'm just trying to take care of the property. The roof is in poor condition and could cause damage if not fixed soon." "That's not the point," I insisted. "This is our home, and these decisions correspond to Diego and me." "Well, considering that we live here and have more experience in maintaining a home, I think we are in a position to make these decisions, he responded in a tone that brooked no argument. That night, when Diego came home from work, I tried again to talk to him about the situation. I found him in our bedroom, loosening his tie with a tired gesture. Diego, we need to talk seriously about your parents, I began, closing the door to make sure they wouldn't hear us. He sighed, sitting up in bed. What happened now? I told him about the incident on the roof, Julia's constant interference with the children, and how I was feeling increasingly displaced in my own home. Honey, this can't go on like this. They need to understand that this is our house and they can't make decisions without consulting us. Diego ran a hand over his face, looking even more tired. I know. I'll talk to them, I promise. You've said that before, I reminded him, feeling the frustration grow in my voice. But nothing changes. In fact, it's getting worse. We need to set clear boundaries, Diego. They're my parents, he responded in a defensive tone. They've been through a lot. I can't just throw them out or treat them like strangers. I'm not asking you to kick them out, I said, trying to stay calm. Just make them understand that they can't run our lives. Diego nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I'll try, I promise. But please be a little more patient. It's a difficult situation for everyone. That night, lying in bed, I heard Julia and Enrique's laughter in the living room. They were watching TV, probably sitting on the couch that had been moved without our permission. Diego slept next to me, apparently oblivious to my anguish. I felt trapped, helpless in my own home. Every day, the control that Julia and Enrique exerted over our lives seemed to grow, and Diego seemed unable or unwilling to set limits on them. The tension was palpable, and I feared the moment everything would explode. As I stared at the ceiling, thinking about how we had gotten into this situation, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could last. The house that had once been our refuge now felt like a prison, and I was losing the battle to maintain control of my own life. With a sigh, I closed my eyes, trying to sleep. Tomorrow would be another day of silent struggle, another day of feeling like a stranger in my own home. And as sleep overcame me, one question lingered in my mind: how could we get our life and our home back without destroying our family in the process? That summer night, the civilian heat filtered through the open windows of our house. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep due to the suffocating atmosphere and the thoughts that kept spinning in my head. I decided to get up to drink a glass of cold water, hoping that would help cool me down and perhaps calm my restless mind. With silent steps, I left the room and headed towards the kitchen. The house was in darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight that filtered through the windows. As I approached the staircase, I heard voices coming from the floor below. I stopped dead, recognizing the voices of Diego and his parents. "Son, we have to talk seriously," I heard Enrique say in a serious tone that put me on alert. I knew I shouldn't listen to other people's conversations, but something in Enrique's tone made me stay still, holding my breath so as not to make noise. "What's wrong, Dad?" Diego responded, his voice sounding tired even from a distance. "Your mother and I have been thinking," Enrique began, "and we believe it is time for us to take action to secure the future of this family." There was a moment of silence before Julia intervened. "Honey, you know we're so grateful for everything you've done for us. But we're also worried about what might happen in the future." "What do you mean?" Diego asked, and I could imagine the look of confusion on his face. "You see, son," Enrique continued, "we've been watching how you and your wife run the house. And, frankly, it worries us. We think it would be safer if our names were on the deed to the house." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. "Were they suggesting what you thought they were suggesting?" "What?" Diego exclaimed, apparently as surprised as I was. "But, why? This is our house, we bought it with our money." "We know, honey," Julia interjected in a honeyed voice, "but think of it as a family security measure. If something happened to you or your wife, what would happen to the children? At least then, we'd know they have a safe home." "But that doesn't make sense," Diego protested. "We already have a will, and the house would pass to the children anyway." "Son," Enrique's voice became firmer, "it's not just about the children. Your mother and I have invested a lot in this house since we arrived. We have improved it, we have taken care of it. I think we deserve some security. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My in-laws, the people we had welcomed into our home in their time of need, were now trying to take over our home. I felt anger and disbelief mix in my chest. I don't know, Dad, Diego's voice sounded doubtful. I would have to talk to. With your wife. Julia interrupted, and I could detect a tone of disdain in her voice. Diego, honey, you know she wouldn't understand. She's always been a little territorial around the house. Territorial, I thought indignantly. It's our house, for God's sake. Also, Enrique continued, think about the future. With our names on the deed, we could help them more. We could even consider expanding the house, making those much-needed renovations. There was a long silence, and I felt my heart pounding in my ears. Please, Diego, I thought, say no. Defend our home. I don't know, Diego finally said, and I felt a pang of relief mixed with disappointment at his indecision. It's a big decision. I need time to think about it. Of course, son, Enrique responded in a tone that sounded almost triumphant. Take your time. But remember, we only want the best for this family. I know, Dad, Diego sighed. I'll think about it, I promise. I heard movement and quickly backed into our room, closing the door carefully so as not to make any noise. I sat on the bed, feeling like the world was spinning around me. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. My in-laws, who had already taken control of almost every aspect of our daily lives, now wanted to legally take over our home. And worst of all, Diego hadn't rejected them right away. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to sleep. My mind ran over and over the conversation I had heard, analyzing every word, every tone of voice. How had we gotten to this point? At what point had my in-laws gone from being grateful guests to wanting to take over our property? When the sun began to peek out the window, I had already made a decision. I couldn't stand by while my family and home were in danger. I needed to act, and I needed to do it quickly. That morning, as Diego got ready to go to work, I watched him with a mixture of love and disappointment. How could he be so blind to his parents' manipulations? Or was he really considering his proposal? Is everything okay, darling? He asked me, noticing my gaze. I forced a smile. Yeah, I'm just a little tired. I didn't sleep well last night. He came over and kissed me on the forehead. Rest today if you can. I love you. And I to you, I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. As soon as Diego walked out the door, I started planning my next move. I couldn't directly confront my in-laws without evidence, and I couldn't trust Diego to take a firm stand. I needed professional help, someone who could guide me through this legally and emotionally complicated situation. I remembered that an old university friend, Marta, had become a lawyer specializing in family law. I decided to contact her for advice. With shaking hands, I dialed his number. After a few rings, I heard his familiar voice. Marta, it's me. I need your help. It's about my house, my in-laws. It's complicated. Calm down, she replied in a calm voice. Tell me everything from the beginning. As I recounted the events of the past few months, culminating in the conversation I had overheard the night before, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was really listening to me, who understood the seriousness of the situation. This is serious, Marta said when I finished. We need to act quickly to protect your rights and property. Can you come to my office this afternoon? Yes, I'll find a way, I replied, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. As I hung up the phone, I looked around the kitchen. The dishes that Julia had rearranged, the curtains that Enrique had changed without consulting. Every corner of the house now bore the mark of his invasive presence. I took a deep breath, feeling a determination I hadn't experienced in months. This was my house, our home, and I was willing to fight for it. With Marta's help, I would find a way to protect my family and our future. As I was getting ready to leave, I heard Julia enter the kitchen. Good morning, dear, he said in his usual tone of false sweetness. Are you going out? Yes, I replied, trying hard to keep my tone neutral. I have some errands to run. She nodded, without suspecting that these procedures could change the course of our lives. As I left the house, I felt a mix of fear and determination. I didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but I was sure of one thing: it was time to take back control of my life and my home. The stifling heat of Seville hit me as soon as I stepped outside. I walked quickly towards the bus stop, my mind still reeling from the conversation I had overheard the night before. Every step I took me further away from the house that I once considered my refuge and that had now become a battlefield. After a bus ride that seemed eternal, I finally arrived at the office building where Marta had her office. The air conditioning greeted me like a refreshing balm when I entered the lobby. "Come in," I heard Marta's voice after gently knocking on her office door. Upon entering, I saw my old friend sitting behind a mahogany desk. The years had passed, but his warm smile and insightful eyes remained the same. "Maria," he said, rising to hug me. "I'm glad to see you, although I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." We sat down and for the next hour I told him everything in great detail. The arrival of my in-laws, their increasing interference in our lives, and finally, the conversation I had overheard the night before. Marta listened attentively, taking notes and asking occasional questions. "Well," he said finally, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose, "the situation is complicated, but not hopeless. The first thing we need to do is clearly establish the legal facts." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning forward in my chair. "The house," Marta explained. "Whose name is it in exactly?" "Diego's and mine," I responded. "We bought it together shortly after we got married." Martha nodded. "That's good. It means that any change in ownership would require your explicit consent. Your in-laws can't just add themselves to the deed without your signature." I felt momentary relief, but then I remembered Diego's indecision. What if Diego decides he wants to add them? "Still," Marta said firmly, "I would need your consent. In Spain, property acquired during a marriage is generally considered community property, meaning that both spouses have equal rights to it. But," he continued, raising a finger in warning, "this doesn't mean we can let our guard down. Emotional pressure and manipulation can be powerful, especially when it comes from family." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "What should I do then?" Marta leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. "First, we need to make sure you have all the documentation in order. Deeds, invoices for improvements made to the house, anything that demonstrates your investment and ownership." He spent the next half hour explaining to me the legal steps we could take to protect my rights to the property. He told me about the possibility of registering a preventive note in the property registry, which would warn of any attempt to change the ownership of the house. Also, Marta added, you should consider having a frank conversation with Diego. Don't mention that you overheard the conversation, but express your concerns about the current situation with his parents. "I've tried," I said with a frustrated sigh. "But he always defends them or avoids the topic." "I understand," Marta said sympathetically. "But it's crucial that you are on the same page. If you can't resolve this between yourselves, we might consider family mediation as a next step." As Marta spoke, I felt a mix of emotions: relief at finally having a plan of action, fear for what it could mean for my marriage, and deep sadness that it had reached this point. "Maria," Marta said softly, noticing my expression, "I know this is difficult. But remember, you are not doing anything wrong. You are protecting your family and your home." I nodded, blinking back tears. "I know. It's just, I never thought I'd be in this situation. When we took in my in-laws, I just wanted to help." "Your kindness is not a weakness," Marta stated. "But now is the time to be strong, for yourself and your children." We spent the next hour discussing strategies and next steps. Marta gave me a list of documents I needed to gather and explained the possible legal scenarios we could face. "One more thing," Marta said before I left. "Everything we've discussed today is confidential. Don't mention to anyone, not even Diego for now, that you've sought legal advice. It could complicate things if your in-laws find out." I nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "Thank you, Marta. I don't know what I would do without you." "That's what friends are for," she smiled, giving me a hug goodbye. "Keep me informed and don't hesitate to call me if you need anything else." I left Marta's office feeling as if I had woken up from a long dream. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a plan, a direction. She was no longer a passive victim of circumstances, but a woman willing to fight for her home and family. As I walked back to the bus stop, the afternoon sun bathed the streets of Seville in a golden glow. I watched the families strolling, the couples sharing ice cream on the terraces, and felt a pang of nostalgia for the life we used to have before everything got complicated. On the bus home, my mind wouldn't stop spinning. How would Diego react when we finally had that difficult conversation? Would my in-laws understand that their actions were harming our family instead of protecting it? Could we ever get back to normal? As the bus wound its way through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I made a decision. Tonight, after the children were asleep, he would talk to Diego. I wouldn't tell her about the conversation I had overheard or about my visit to Marta, but I would clearly express my concerns and my desire to set clear boundaries with her parents. I got off the bus and walked the last few meters to our house. From the outside, everything seemed normal. The same white walls, the same flowers in the windows. But I knew that behind that facade of normality, a silent battle was being waged for control of our lives. I took a deep breath before opening the door. I didn't know what was waiting for me inside, but I was ready to face it. With Marta's guidance and my own renewed determination, I felt like I finally had the tools to protect what was mine. "I'm home," I announced as I entered, my voice sounding stronger and more confident than I had felt in months. The sound of my children's footsteps running to greet me reminded me of what I was fighting for. For them, for our home, for our family. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. The days following my visit with Marta were an emotional roller coaster. Every time I tried to talk to Diego, something would come up. The kids needed attention, their parents interrupted, or he just came in so tired from work that we barely had time to exchange more than a few words before he fell asleep. Meanwhile, tension in the house continued to grow. Julia and Enrique seemed more secure than ever in their position, making decisions about the house and the children as if they were the undisputed owners. I bit my tongue, remembering Marta's advice not to provoke an open conflict until I had all my legal affairs in order. Finally, one Friday night, I saw my chance. The kids had gone to bed early, exhausted after a hard week of school, and my in-laws were out to dinner with some old friends who were in town visiting. Diego and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, making tea before going to bed. "Diego," I began, mustering all my courage, "we need to talk about your parents and our current situation." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, honey. In fact, I've been thinking about it a lot too." His answer surprised me. After months of evasions and defenses, I didn't expect him to be willing to address the issue so directly. "Oh yeah?" I asked, trying to keep a neutral tone. "And what have you been thinking?" Diego took a sip of his tea, as if gathering his thoughts. Then, he looked me straight in the eyes and said something I never expected to hear. "Honey, I was thinking, maybe we should sell the house and buy something bigger to better accommodate everyone." I felt like the ground was opening up under my feet. Of all the things I expected Diego to say, this was the last. Sell our house, the home we had built together, where our children had taken their first steps and said their first words. It was inconceivable. "Sell the house?" I repeated, unable to hide my shock. "Diego, what are you talking about?" He didn't seem to notice my dismay and continued, "Think about it. This house is getting too small for all of us. With my parents here, the kids growing up. We need more space. Plus, we could look for something in a better neighborhood, maybe with a garden for children." Every word that came out of his mouth made me feel more and more distant from him. How could he suggest something like that so casually? Didn't he understand what this house meant to us? "Diego," I said, fighting to stay calm, "this is our house. We chose it together, we decorated it together. It has all our memories. I can't believe you're considering selling it just because your parents are here temporarily." "Temporarily?" Diego responded, frowning. "Maria, you know my parents have nowhere to go. We can't just throw them out on the street." "I'm not suggesting we kick them out," I replied, feeling frustration building inside me. "But we cannot reorganize our entire life around them. This situation was supposed to be temporary, Do you remember? Diego passed a hand on his face, a gesture that he had seen thousands of times but now seemed that of a stranger. I know. But things have changed. They need us, and honestly, they have been very helpful with children and the house. I felt like I had been slapped. Didn't he see how his parents had been undermining my authority in my own home? How had every decision he made? Diego, I said, trying to maintain my stable voice, your parents have not been an aid. They have been taking control of our house, criticizing everything I do, interfering with how we create our children. Don't you see it? He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Come on, Maria. You are exaggerating. They are just trying to help. I know that sometimes they can be a bit intense, but they have good intentions. Good intentions? I repeated, incredulous. Diego, have you noticed how they talk to me? How do you question every decision I make about children or the house? They are worried about us, Diego replied, his tone becoming defensive. They just want the best for this family. At that time, I remembered the conversation he had heard, that night when his parents suggested putting their names in the writing of the house. Was this idea of selling part of your plan? Were they manipulating Diego to get what they wanted? Diego, I said, trying one last time to see reality, your parents are not thinking about the best for our family. They are thinking about the best for them. Don't you see how they have been taking control of everything since they arrived? But Diego seemed to have closed completely. I can't believe you are speaking like that about my parents, he said, his voice full of disappointment. After everything they have done for us. And what about what we have done for them? I replied, feeling how frustration tears threatened to sprout. We opened our house when they needed it, and now they want to keep it. Diego got up abruptly, his chair squeaking against the kitchen floor. I think we need time to calm us down, he said, his tense voice. We'll talk about this later. I saw him get out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my cup of tea now cold and a million thoughts running for my mind. How had we gotten to this point? When my husband, my partner, had become someone I barely recognized. That night, lying on the bed while Diego slept by my side, I made a decision. I couldn't continue like this. I could not allow my home, my family, all for what I had worked, be taken from my hands. The next morning, early, before anyone else in the house woke up, I called Marta. I need your help, I said as soon as he answered. Things have worsened. Diego wants to sell the house. I heard Marta take a deep breath on the other side of the line. I understand, he said calmly. Come to my office this afternoon. We have a lot to discuss. While hung the phone, I looked around the kitchen. Each corner kept a memory, the mark on the wall where we measured the height of the children, the cracked tile where Sophia had dropped her favorite dish, the window next to which Diego and I used to have breakfast on Sundays in the morning, planning our future. I couldn't let all that disappear. Not without fighting. With a renewed determination, I began to prepare for the day. I didn't know exactly what would hold the future, but I was sure of one thing. This house, our home, was worth fighting for her. And I was ready for that fight. The days following the conversation with Diego became a kind of nightmare in slow motion. Every morning I woke me up with the hope that everything would have been a bad dream, just to face the harsh reality of our situation. Diego and I talked to us, moving around the house as ghosts, avoiding any contact beyond what is strictly necessary to maintain a normal facade in front of the children. Meanwhile, Julia and Enrique seemed to have gained new confidence, as if they could smell discord between us and knew they were gaining ground. One afternoon, while preparing dinner in the kitchen, I heard Julia talking to Sophia in the living room. Honey, he said with that milky tone that he had come to detest, when we move to the new house, you will have a much bigger room. Wouldn't it be wonderful? I felt the blood boiled. How did I dare to make promises to my daughter about a decision that had not even been taken? I was about to break into the living room to face it, but it contained me. I couldn't allow me to lose my stirrups, not now that everything was at stake. That night, after bedtime, I locked myself in the bathroom and called Marta. I can't continue like this, I said, my voice just a whisper to avoid being heard. They are manipulating my children, Marta. They are acting as if the sale of the house was an consummated fact. I understand your frustration, Marta replied calmly. But remember, legally they can't do anything without your consent. The house is still yours and Diego. But Diego is on his side, I replied, feeling how tears began to sprout. I don't know if I can trust him to protect our interests. There was a moment of silence on the other side of the line before Marta spoke again. Maria, he said in a serious tone, I think the time has come to consider more drastic options. Have you thought about the possibility of temporary separation? His words hit me like a stomach punch. Separation? The mere idea seemed inconceivable. In spite of everything, I was still loving Diego. We had built a life together, we had 2 wonderful children. How could we have reached this point? No. I don't know, I finally replied, my voice breaking. I never thought we would get to this. I am not saying that it is the only option, Marta clarified quickly. But it could be a way of making Diego realize the seriousness of the situation. Sometimes people do not value what they have until they are about to lose it. I spent the night in Candle, weighing my options. Every scenario I imagined seemed worse than the previous one. What would happen to children if we separated? How would Diego react? And his parents? The idea of leaving my home, of moving away from my children even if it was temporarily, was unbearable. But as the hours passed and dawn approached, a certainty began to grow inside me. I couldn't continue like this. I could not allow my family to be destroyed by manipulation and lack of communication. I had to do something drastic, something that shook the foundations of this unsustainable situation. The next morning, I got up before anyone else at home. I dressed carefully, choosing a suit that made me feel strong and safe. I prepared breakfast for children like any other day, but each movement was loaded with a special meaning. Would this be the last time I would do this in the near future? When Diego entered the kitchen, dressed to go to work, I felt my heart accelerated. It was now or never. Diego, I said, my strongest voice than I felt, we have to talk. He looked at me, surprised by my tone. Now. I'm about to go for work. This can't wait, I insisted. Please, sit down. Something in my expression should have warned him about the seriousness of the situation, because he sat without more protests. I took a deep breath, gathering all my courage. Diego, I started, I have been thinking a lot about our situation. About your parents, about the house, about us. He nodded slowly, his cautious expression. I've also been thinking about it. I know you don't agree with the idea of selling, but it's not just about selling the house, I interrupted it. It's about us, our family, how we have allowed this situation to get so far. Diego frowned, clearly confused by the direction that the conversation was taking. What do you mean? I felt that my resolution faltered for a moment, but I forced myself to continue. Diego, I love you. I love the life we have built together. But I can't continue like this. I can't live in a house where I feel like a stranger, where my decisions are constantly questioned and undercut. Maria, me. Please let me finish, I said, raising a hand to stop it. I have tried to talk to you many times, but you always defend your parents. You don't see how their presence is affecting our relationship, our family. Diego passed a hand through the hair, a gesture that used to find an endearing but now I only irritated me. They are trying to help, Maria. I know that sometimes they can be a bit intense, but they are family. We are family, Diego, I replied, feeling how accumulated frustration for months threatened to overflow. You, me, and the children. That is the family that you should be protecting. There was a tense moment of silence between us. I could see the internal fight in Diego's eyes, confusion, pain. Part of me wanted to go back, hug him and tell him that we would find a solution together. But I knew that if I gave up now, nothing would change. Diego, I finally said, my voice just a whisper, I have made a decision. He looked at me, and I could see the fear reflected in his eyes. What decision? At that time, I felt a surreal calm seizing me. It was as if I were watching the scene from outside my body, seeing this strong and determined woman that I barely recognized as myself. Be of one thing, Diego, I said, my surprisingly serene voice. I want divorce. The clash on his face was immediate and deep. His eyes opened in Pa, his mouth opened but no sound left her. In the silence that followed my statement, I could clearly hear the sound of something falling and breaking into the kitchen. Julia, without a doubt, had been listening to our conversation. "Di divorcio?" Diego finally stuttered, his voice barely audible. "Maria, you can't serious. We have problems, yes, but divorce." "I speak completely," I replied, maintaining my composure even though I was inside that I was falling apart. "I have tried to talk to you. I have tried to make you see how the situation with your parents is destroying our marriage, but you don't listen to me. You don't see what is happening." Diego got up abruptly, his chair squeaking against the kitchen floor. "This is crazy, Maria. You can't make such a sudden decision. Think of children, in our family. It is precisely in them that I am thinking," I replied, my voice breaking slightly for the first time. "They deserve to grow in a happy home, not in the midst of this constant tension." At that time, Julia entered the kitchen, her face a mask of false concern. "What's happening here?" I heard altered voices. I looked directly, without trying to hide my irritation. "This is a private conversation between my husband and me, Julia. I would appreciate you to leave us alone." Julia seemed surprised by my firm tone, something that had rarely used with her. He looked at Diego, as if waiting for him to defend her, but he was still paralyzed, looking at me with a mixture of disbelief and pain. "It will be better if I leave," Julia finally said, slowly going back. "But remember, we are family. Any problem can be solved speaking." When he left the kitchen, I made my attention to Diego. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling how tears began to form in my eyes. "But I don't see another way out. I can't keep living like this." Diego dropped back into the chair, his face in his hands. "Maria, please. There must be another solution. We can go to therapy, I can talk to my parents, we can—" "It's too late for that, Diego," I interrupted gently. "I have made my decision." With trembling hands, I took out the divorce papers that Marta had prepared for me. I placed them on the table in front of Diego. "What is this?" he asked, although for his expression it was evident that he already knew. "Divorce papers," I replied. "I have had them prepared for a while. I hoped not having to use them, but I don't see another option." Diego looked up from the papers, his eyes full of tears. "Maria, please. I love you. We can fix this." I felt that my resolution faltered for a moment. A part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to give him another chance. But I knew that if I gave up now, nothing would really change. "I love you too, Diego," I said softly. "But sometimes love is not enough. We need respect, trust, and commitment. And at this time, I don't feel we have that." The silence that followed was deafening. I could listen to the clock tick-tick on the wall, the distant hum of traffic outside the house. It was as if the world had stopped, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Diego spoke, his voice just a whisper. "What will happen to children?" "I propose shared custody," I replied. "I know you're a good father, Diego. That has never been in doubt." He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the papers in front of him. "And the house?" "We will have to negotiate it," I said. "But I think it would be best to sell it and divide money. Neither of them should stay here with all these memories." Diego looked up, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, I saw the man who had fallen in love with so many years ago, the man with whom he had dreamed of spending the rest of my life. But that man seemed so far now, so different from the one who was sitting in front of me. "Are you sure this, Maria?" he asked one last time. "Is there nothing I can do to change your mind?" I felt how tears finally overflowed, rolling down my cheeks. "I'm sorry, Diego. I really feel. But I think this is the best for everyone." With those words, I felt as if something inside me was definitely broken. It was the end of an era, the end of the dreams and hopes we had shared. But it was also the beginning of something new, although at that time I could not see exactly what. While Diego took the papers with trembling hands, I knew that our lives would never be the same again. The path we had ahead would be difficult and painful, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was taking control of my life. The future was uncertain, but at least now it was mine to mold it. The days that followed my decision to divorce me were a whirlwind of emotions and frantic activity. The news fell like a bomb in our family, shaking the foundations of life that we had built for so many years. Diego remained in a state of shock during the first days, alternating between desperate pleas to reconsider my decision and moments of anger in which I accused me of destroying our family. His parents, on the other hand, did not waste time to show their true nature. "You are an ungrateful," Julia shouted for me one afternoon, when I confronted her on her attempts to put the children against me. "After everything we have done for you, do you pay us?" Enrique, on the other hand, adopted a more calculating approach. I listened to him one night speaking with Diego in the studio. "Son, you have to be smart now," he said. "You don't sign anything without consulting a lawyer. That woman wants to take everything away." It was at that time that I realized that the battle that had ahead would be harder than I had imagined. Not only was I fighting for my independence and my future, but also against a narrative that painted me as the villain of history. The children, of course, were the ones who suffered the most with the situation. Sophia, with her 8 years, seemed to understand more than I would have liked. I found her a night crying silently in her room. "Mom," he told me between sobs, "is it my fault that you and Dad separate?" I felt as if they had stabbed my heart. I sat next to her in bed and hugged her tightly. "No, my love," I assured him, fighting my own tears. "None of this is your fault, neither yours nor your brother. Sometimes, adults have problems that we cannot solve, but that does not mean that we stop loving you." Mateo, being smaller, did not completely understand what was happening, but I could feel the tension in the house. He became silent and withdrawn, clinging to me or Diego every time we were in the same room, as if we were going to disappear at any time. The following weeks were a constant coming and going of lawyers, mediators, and family counselors. Marta, faithful to her word, fought tirelessly for my rights, making sure that every aspect of divorce was fair and equitable. "Remember, Maria," he told me during one of our meetings, "you have every right to a fair distribution of goods. Do not let them intimidate or make you feel guilty." Despite his support, there were times when I felt I could not move on. The nights were especially difficult. Lying in the guest room, where I had moved to avoid more confrontations with Diego, I wondered again and again if I had made the right decision. Was he being selfish? Should I have fought more for my marriage? But every morning, when I got up and saw how Julia and Enrique continued trying to control every aspect of our lives, he remembered why I had made this decision first. It was not only me, it was about creating a healthy environment for my children, of teaching them that it is fine to establish limits and fight for what you think. The divorce process was long and exhausting. There were moments of extreme tension, such as Diego, influenced by his parents, he tried to argue that he deserved most of the property due to his greater financial contribution during our marriage. And what about my contribution? I argued during one of our mediation sessions. Who took care of the house and children while you built your career? Is that no value? It was at that time that I saw a flash of recognition in Diego's eyes, as if I was finally seeing the situation from my perspective. That night, I was surprised to talk to me privately. "Sorry, Maria," he told me, his voice full of emotion. "I've been as blinding for what my parents wanted, that I forgot to listen to you really. You're right. Your contribution to our family is as valuable as mine." That moment of understanding marked a turning point in our negotiations. From then on, Diego began to show more willingness to reach a fair agreement, even if that meant going against his parents' wishes. Finally, after months of negotiations, we reached an agreement. The house would be sold and the money divided equally among us. We agreed to the shared custody of the children, with a calendar that allowed us to both spend significant time with them. The day we signed the divorce papers was bittersweet. On the one hand, I felt immense relief to know that I could finally begin to rebuild my life in my own terms. On the other hand, I could not help feeling a deep sadness when thinking about the dreams and hopes we had shared and now came to an end. "I hope you find happiness, Maria," Diego told me after we both signed. His voice was soft, almost nostalgic. "I'm sorry that things have ended." "I also sorry," I replied, feeling a lump in my throat. But I think it's the best for everyone. The following months were a period of adjustment and discovery. I found a small apartment near the children's school, and little by little I began to fill it with new memories and experiences. It was a painful but also liberating process, as if I was getting rid of layers of a life that no longer belonged to me. Julia and Enrique, on the other hand, finally moved to their own place, although not before making a last attempt to manipulate. "You know you will always be like a daughter for us," Julia told me the day they moved, her sweet voice but her cold eyes. "You can always change your mind." "Thank you, Julia," I replied, maintaining my composure. "But I think we all need our own space now." Seeing the empty house for the last time was a surreal experience. Each room was full of memories, both good and bad. But while I closed the door for the last time, I felt as if I was closing a chapter of my life and opening a new one. The children, surprisingly, adapted better than expected to our new situation. Although there were difficult times, especially at the beginning, little by little they began to accept the new normality. "Mom," Sophia told me one night while she was wrapped in her new room, "do you know what? I like you smaller now." His words took me by surprise, and I felt how tears were formed in my eyes. I had not realized how much I had changed, how the weight he had been carrying for so long had finally risen. Over time, even my relationship with Diego began to improve. Without the constant pressure of their parents and the tension of living together, we could begin to rebuild a friendship based on mutual respect and love for our children. One day, while we exchanged the children for the weekend, Diego surprised me with a confession. "You know, Maria," he told me, his voice full of emotion, "although it hurt at the time, I think you made the right decision. We both deserved to be happy, and we weren't together, not that way." His words were like a balm for my soul, a validation that, despite all the pain and difficulties, he had taken the right path. While seeing my children run towards Diego, laughing and telling him about his week, I felt a peace that he had not experienced in a long time. The road had been difficult, full of obstacles and moments of doubt, but I could finally see the light at the end of the tunnel. That night, sitting on the little balcony of my new apartment, looking at the stars on Seville, I reflected on everything that had happened. I had lost a lot, it is true, but I had also gained something invaluable: my independence, my voice, my ability to make decisions for myself and my children. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he looked at him with hope and expectation. I had learned that sometimes, the end of a story is only the beginning of another, and I was ready to write the next chapter of my life, this time in my own terms.